Today, I'm excited to welcome author and psychologist Steve Taylor, who you might recognize as my guest from episode 13, back to the show. I enjoyed our conversation about Steve's most recent book, which is called The Leap, The Psychology of Spiritual Awakening, so much that I wanted to have him back on so we can talk in greater depth about the collective awakening of consciousness that he describes in the book, as well as the role that we as individuals play in it. Steve is the author of numerous books on spirituality and psychology, and in The Leap, he provides what is perhaps the clearest psychological study of the state of wakefulness ever published. He resides in the United Kingdom, where he is a senior lecturer in psychology at Leeds Beckett University, and he came to New World Library through Eckhart Tolle, the international best-selling author of The Power of Now. Both The Leap and Steve's first book that we published, called The Calm Center, are part of our Eckhart Tolle Editions imprint, which features books personally selected by Eckhart for publication. I've been thinking a lot about the wisdom that Steve shared with me in our first interview, and it's an honor to have the opportunity to speak with him again. So welcome, Steve, and thanks for coming back.
Hi, Kim. It's great to be back on the show.
I thought before we dive back into our dialogue about The Leap that I'd love to hear the story of how your path first crossed with Eckhart's and what it's been like to work with him.
Oh, okay. Well, it goes back to 2005 when I had a book called The Fall published. And coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, it was published on the same day as Eckhart's A New Earth back in October 2005. And when I read The New Earth, I realized it was quite similar in some ways to The Fall. So both books deal with the insanity of the human ego in history and how it's caused so much conflict and discord throughout all human cultures. So I decided to send Eckhart the book, my book, The Fall. And about six months later, I got an email from his assistant to say that Eckhart really liked the book and wanted to speak to me about it. And I spoke to Eckhart on the phone a few days later. And he told me that he loved the book so much he wanted to help me promote it. So he gave me a great quote for the back cover. And he put the book on his website as on his list of recommended books. So it was a great boost to my book, The Fall. And we stayed in contact and we talked on the phone. We became friendly with each other. Although I didn't meet him until 2012 when he invited me to Canada to take part in a dialogue for Eckhart TV. And that was great. I met Kim, his wife, and we hung out together. We went for meals, and he showed me Vancouver. And we had a great time, and we've stayed in touch ever since. We usually meet up when he's in London. And so I think one of the times, about 3 years ago when he was in London, he said to me he was thinking of starting his own publishing imprint. And when I was in Vancouver in 2012, I'd given him a copy of a book of poems of mine called The Meaning. And he told me when we met in London that he liked the book of poems so much that when he started his own publishing imprint, he wanted the first book to be my next book of poems, which I hadn't actually finished then. But over the following year, I completed a new book of poetic reflections. And I sent them all off to Eckhart, and he chose the ones he liked to be in the book. And that became The Calm Center. And then there was a similar process a year or two later when I wrote my book, The Leap. So yeah, it's been great working with Eckhart. As you can imagine, he's very easygoing and he's very full of grace and full of. He has a very peaceful presence. So it's great to be working with him.
Oh, well, we're so lucky that he brought you to us. And I thought that I'd start by sharing a quote from the foreword that Eckhart wrote to The Leap. He says, "The fact that enormous collective challenges almost certainly lie ahead for humanity, most of them self-created by the unawakened egoic state of consciousness that still has the majority of humans in its grip, should not be interpreted as an indication that a more widespread awakening is not going to occur. The opposite is probably the case. The crises we are experiencing and the greater turmoil to come may act as a catalyst for a collective shift in consciousness." And there's tons there, but I'd like to just start by having you speak for just a minute about the unawakened egoic state of consciousness that he mentions, which you call the sleep state in The Leap, and how it manifests in our lives.
Yeah, well, sleep is, as Eckhart says, the ordinary state of human consciousness. And it begins really with childhood. I think in childhood, maybe we'll talk about this a bit later, in childhood, we experience what I would call a natural wakefulness. So children have a very vivid perception of the world around them. They have a natural sense of joy and well-being, a sense of wonder at the world around them, a sense of connection as well to nature, a sense of connection to other people. But when we become adults, we feel a sense of separation. We become isolated within our own egos, within our own mental space, and we become disconnected from the world around us, from other people. We become selfishly orientated to some degree. Our own needs and desires begin to take precedence, and the world around us becomes a familiar, even a mundane place. And we lose that natural joy which children have. It's almost as if we become so full inside that we become so cluttered up with ambitions and resentments and grudges and all kinds of attachments and accumulations that we lose touch with that spontaneous joy which children have. So that's really our sleep state, and I think most human beings in the world experience that. And sleep, it creates a desire for, a need for group identity. There's a sense of vulnerability that comes with separateness. If you feel separate, you also feel somehow incomplete, as if you're a fragment which has been broken off from the whole. So that creates a desire for belonging, a need for group identity. So that sense of separateness leads to nationalism, it leads to racism, it leads to religious fundamentalism and many other kinds of pathology. Ultimately, it leads to warfare as well, because most wars are born from a sense of group identity and a sense of difference between two different groups. And also it leads to a desire to accumulate as well. It leads to a desire to accumulate possessions, to accumulate success or status, to accumulate wealth, all to try to assuage that sense of incompleteness and that sense of separation. But as Eckhart says, I think there is a gradual process of awakening taking place. Maybe, I think still the majority of people are still in a state of sleep. The state of sleep still has a major hold over the human race, but I think that hold is beginning to weaken and loosen over time.
Yeah, as we become more aware of it, it does. Yeah. And I love that you brought up the natural joy of children. I wasn't going to quite go here yet, but I'm going to leap right here because one of my favorite chapters of the book is the chapter on the natural wakefulness of children. Because in addition to the work that I do through New World Library, I've also had a website called iskip.com for the last 18 years, which encourages adults to reconnect with the joy of skipping, which we all did naturally as kids, but so often lose touch with as adults. And skipping, and just to be clear, I'm talking about the kind without a rope, just leaping down the street, is my personal favorite spiritual practice because not only does it instantly lift my spirits, I can't be in my ego that worries so much about what other people are going to think and joyfully skip down the street in public as an adult at the same time. So this quote in particular stood out from that chapter. You write, "Wakefulness is the place where we began, which we slipped away from when our adult egos developed. And it's the place we return to when we wake up as adults. The place we return to in a deeper and more integrated way." And I'd love for you to speak for a little bit about the natural presence we experience as kids and how that compares to wakefulness in adulthood.
Yeah, I think one of the things which happens when, I realized this when I had kids myself, when my wife and I started a family about 14 years ago. And I know it was 14. It was my son's 14th birthday yesterday, so it was obviously 14 years ago. But when we started, I think a lot of people experience this. When you have kids, you sort of become a child again yourself. You reconnect with your own childhood self. And I did this because it's a bit like what you were saying about skipping, that when you play with children, you effectively become a child yourself. If you give yourself wholly to the act of play, you enter, this sort of very vivid, very spontaneous world, and you become very present. When you play with children, you're completely present. There's no time for any anxiety about the future. There's no time for any memories or any resentment about the past. You just give yourself wholly to the present moment in the play. And I realized that when my son was a bit older and we'd go for walks, we'd walk to the shops or wherever, it would always take us about 25 minutes to do what should have been a 5-minute journey. because he would always be stopping everywhere to examine stones or leaves or to stare at the sky or to look around. So that makes you be mindful as well. I became very mindful myself. I began to live slowly, to take in the isness of my surroundings in the way that children do. So, children, in some ways, they're naturally very mindful. They're very present, and also they're quite slow. They're not obsessed with future deadlines. They can give themselves the opportunity to be wholly here and now within their experience. And as I say, we lose that as we become adults and the abstract ego develops. We become kind of enclosed within our own mental space and within our own thoughts. Our minds begin to chatter away. And children don't have thought chatter until they're maybe their early teens. That's when their minds start to become busy with associational chatter. But when we become adults, we become confined to our own egos. We become more separate. And in many ways, spiritual awakening undoes that kind of development. It's a full circle which takes us back to many of the characteristics of childhood. So, I just said that children are very present, and we regain that sense of presence in adulthood. We also regain the amazingly vivid and fresh perception of children. The world comes to life again. The world becomes more beautiful. We regain a sense of awe at the world as well. We become curious in the way that children are curious. And we're never bored. The world becomes a very fascinating place. And it's a lot to do with transcending that sense of being a separate entity which lives within your mental space. So as adults, when we wake up, we regain that sense of connection, that sense of participation which children have, and that sense of the natural joy which they also have.
I was struck as I read that chapter. I kept coming back to feeling like being reminded of the hero's journey that Joseph Campbell wrote about, and how, it's like leaving home and then going through these journeys and dark night of the soul and then a return home. Do you see any connection there?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. There's a famous verse from the poet T.S. Eliot. And if I remember it rightly, it says, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of our exploring will be to arrive where we began and see the place for the first time." And yeah, that's beautiful. And it expresses a similar idea that we return to the place where we began, but it's no longer quite the same place. And we go through this kind of middle ground, this dark night of the soul, if you like, this phase of confusion and discord and separation and isolation. But we come out of it and we regain contact with the essential being, which children experience all the time. But obviously it's not quite the same, because we have our adult minds, we have all the psychological structures and the psychological functions of adulthood, which children don't have. And in some ways, it's a slightly different wakefulness. It's a kind of, I sometimes call it a mature wakefulness, because it retains a lot of the characteristics of childhood wakefulness, but also a few other characteristics which depend on, the kind of psychological functions of adulthood and the psychological structures which enable people to think rationally or abstractly.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating. Okay, so this passage is also from Eckhart's Forward, and he says, "Don't tell the world, make me happy. You would be placing an impossible demand on it and condemning yourself to perpetual frustration. Instead, allow the world to make you conscious." And then he goes on to say that every seeming obstacle to our happiness or fulfillment is a potential portal into presence. So could you explain what he means by allowing the world to make us conscious and how that compares to the pursuit of happiness?
Yeah, well, I think there's a paradox in human existence, in that we all, in some way, strive to be happy. We want our lives to be comfortable and easy in some ways. We like to have, we like to be free of suffering. We like to feel stable and secure in our lives. So there is that impulse for security and stability, but also we have an impulse for challenge and for development. So we have an impulse to grow as well. We have these dual impulses, this kind of static impulse to be secure and stable, and a dynamic impulse to grow and to develop. And in some ways, those impulses are quite contrary, because in order to develop and grow, your life has to have challenges within it. You have to have some degree of struggle and maybe even of difficulty. And in response to challenges, we become deeper. We find resources within ourselves. We break down automated habits and patterns, and we uncover resilience and confidence within ourselves, hidden strengths, and we become deeper. We become wider and deeper through undergoing challenges, through undergoing suffering. So that's why, a lot of the sufferings in people's lives, often, as I say in the Leap, often suffering can be the trigger of spiritual awakening. I found in my research that of all the causes of sudden and dramatic spiritual awakening, by far the most common is intense psychological turmoil for people who are diagnosed with a serious illness, people who suffer from a bereavement or addiction or depression. That's often a trigger of a shift into spiritual awakening. And, maybe going back to the global situation and the difficulties the human race is undergoing at the moment generally, then maybe the collective difficulties we're undergoing, maybe they are a spur for collective awakening too. So there's definitely a parallel between, how suffering can trigger individual awakening to how our collective difficulties could be spurring us towards a collective awakening.
Yes, I love being able to see that connection. It helps me so much right now with what's going on. And I'm also reminded of a group that I've been a part of for like a decade now called Women Praying Dangerously. And it's a group where we get together and we pray, but we don't pray for what our ego wants. We welcome whatever will ultimately serve the greater good and our own growth, which is dangerous for the ego.
Yeah, that's right. There's that great saying, I don't know where this saying comes from, but it's, what is it? It's, when the ego weeps for what it has lost, the soul smiles for what it has gained.
I love that. Oh, that's so powerful. Okay, so I'm going to just keep riffing off of Eckhart's forward because there's so much here. He says, your life is not determined by what happens to you, but by how you respond to what happens. Most importantly, don't add to the collective unconscious, which manifests particularly in the media and politics through your reactivity. Bring the light of consciousness to every encounter, every problem, and every Facebook post. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what he means by not adding to the collective unconscious through our reactivity, because I think there's a lot of that going on right now.
Yeah, it reminds me of the Buddha. The Buddha had a great saying that, if you are ill, don't add to your suffering by becoming depressed about being ill. Just allow your illness to manifest itself and accept your illness. So often when we're in a state of suffering, we add to the suffering with our own mental reactions to it. So it's a bit like, for example, if you lose your job, or if you're in a traffic jam or something like that, in any negative situation, your mind immediately latches onto the situation and creates more suffering. You start to anticipate problems in the future. You start to indulge in kind of why me thinking. Why did this have to happen to me? Why do bad things always happen to me? So you always sort of catastrophize these situations. So you add to the negative situation itself through your own mental reactions to it. So, in our present political difficulties, both in America and Europe, which I won't go into detail about because we've seen enough of them in the news, enough about it in the news. But, it's easy to react to these situations with anger and disappointment or depression, a sense of outrage even. But in reality, that is not very productive because it really does just add to the collective discord and the collective negativity. So I think the best way to approach it is to have a sense of what is right and wrong, have a sense of morality about these things, and a sense of justice, and a desire to follow the right path and to correct some of the wrongs which are taking place. But rather than expressing that through anger, express it through positive action. It doesn't really do anybody any good to start shouting and throwing things at walls, to get angry with yourself, to feel frustrated. That really doesn't do you any good. It doesn't really do the world any good. The best thing is to contain your frustration and convert it into positive action.
Right, and come at it from a place of presence versus just being caught up in the fear of what's going on. Yeah,
and I think often, a lot of the political shenanigans which take place in the world are very ego-based. Most politicians are very ego-orientated individuals who are very focused on power. They have a very domineering personality, and they want to gain as much status and as much wealth as they can. And they're very happy to exploit other individuals because they usually don't have a well-developed sense of empathy. But the best way to counter the actions of these individuals is not through being ego-orientated yourself. The best way is to sort of bypass or transcend your ego and allow a greater sense of purpose to flow through you. So a lot of the great social activists in history were very kind of non-egoic individuals who allowed something greater, something transcendent to flow through them, a kind of altruistic, idealistic impulse which dictated their actions. So I think if we allow our egos to step aside and allow this idealistic, altruistic sense of purpose to flow through us, then that will manifest itself in positive action.
Right. We have about a minute left, and this is a big question for a minute, but I'm gonna ask it anyway because it's kind of rhetorical in some ways. But you asked this question in the Leap: can we wake up in time? Can the positive traits associated with wakefulness transcend the negative traits associated with sleep before our present crisis leads to catastrophe? And I'm curious to hear just briefly what your thoughts are on the answer to that question.
Wow. Well, I think it's going to be, tricky, and I don't know for sure, but I do have a sense that the collective awakening is gaining speed. In my research, I have this feeling that this sensibility that more and more people are undergoing this sudden and dramatic shift into wakefulness, and more people are having awakening experiences. In fact, I read some research just a few days ago which suggested that spiritual experiences are becoming more common, and they're a lot more common now than they were 20 or 30 years ago. So that's quite that's a cause for positivity. So there is this collective awakening which is underway, and I think even all the negativity which is happening in the world, that could be a positive sign in a way, because negative aspects always try to reinforce themselves and become more ossified and more rigid because when they are threatened. So I think the characteristics of sleep sense that somehow they're being threatened, and they're trying to become more rigid to reassert themselves. But I think it's going to be tricky. I'm not sure what's going to happen over the next few decades, but I am cautiously optimistic.
Yes, and it's better to be present and aware for whatever happens, regardless, I think.
Yeah, it's better to be in a state of presence and acceptance.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for the big picture view that you are offering all of us and with what's going on, and it's just very helpful, and I really appreciate your time and you being back on the show with me.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kim. It's great to speak to you again.
For more information about Steve Taylor and The Leap, visit him online at stephenmtaylor.com. That's STEVENM Taylor.com. And as always, if you enjoyed today's podcast, your 5-star rating and or review in iTunes would be greatly appreciated. I'd also like to invite you to join the New World Now podcast community on Facebook, where you can be a part of discussions, on current episodes and stay up to date on the latest and greatest podcast news. Simply search for New World Now podcast on Facebook to join the group. I hope to see you there and look forward to connecting on future episodes of New World Now.
Thank you for listening